The wind screamed across the jagged cliffs of the mountain pass, carrying with it the smell of snow and gunpowder. The outpost was little more than a scar on the mountainside, sandbags, a few prefabricated huts, a communications mast that groaned under the constant gusts. To most, it looked insignificant. To Sergeant Elena Ward, it was the last line of defense between her homeland and a determined enemy force. She stood by the sandbag wall, scanning the ridgeline through her binoculars. The sky was bruised purple with the last of the evening light, and the mountains looked like the bones of giants. She had seen enough battles to know when silence meant danger. Behind her, Corporal Marisol Vega was hunched over a table, soldering wires with trembling hands. Spools of copper wire, C4 bricks, and a detonator lay scattered. The two of them had been tasked with holding this outpost after most of their platoon had been pulled back to reinforce another front. Reinforcements wouldn't arrive until morning. If the enemy came tonight, it would be just them, and whatever they could rig out of the explosives cache. "Elena," Marisol whispered, not lifting her eyes from the tangle of circuits. "You really think they'll try tonight?" Elena lowered the binoculars, her jaw tight. "They don't waste daylight climbing that ridge. Night's when they move. If they want this outpost, they'll come like shadows." Marisol cursed under her breath, wiping sweat from her brow despite the cold. She was 24, just 2 years younger than Elena, but battle had aged her. Both women bore the marks of endless marches, sleepless nights, and wounds stitched too quickly to heal properly. They weren't supposed to be here, not alone. Yet here they were, the outpost forgotten, their lives measured in detonation caps and trigger wires. The radio hissed in the corner of the hut. Static, broken by a brief crackle. Then silence. The signal had been jammed. Elena felt her stomach twist. That was no accident. The enemy was cutting them off, making sure no distress call could go out. She turned to Marisol, voice steady though her hands clenched on the binoculars. "It's tonight. Keep wiring those charges. We'll make this mountain bleed before they take it." Outside, the darkness grew deeper, swallowing the peaks. Then, faintly, like ghosts carried by the wind, came the metallic scrape of boots on rock. The hunt had begun. The mountains were still dark when Elena moved again, her boots crunching softly on the gravel. The thin alpine air bit at her lungs, but her hands stayed steady, carrying the small, weather-beaten kit of wires, fuses, and old blocks of C, for that she had checked 3 times during the night. No one in command had given her these orders. She was improvising, gambling with every piece of equipment she had left. The outpost was never built to withstand a full assault. Its wooden towers leaned in the cold wind, and the sandbag walls sagged after months of rain and snow. A dozen men couldn't hold this ridge against 100 attackers, not even with machine guns. But Elena wasn't planning to hold it the way they expected. She was planning to make it fight back. The silence before the storm. The valley below was quiet, far too quiet. She had served long enough to know the enemy was out there, massing, waiting for the signal to climb. They would not charge until they were certain of victory. That silence meant she had a few precious hours left. Her comrade Vasquez sat propped against the sandbags, a blood-soaked bandage wrapped around his side. He tried to joke with her as she worked, his voice a weak rasp. "Looks like you're building Christmas lights out here." Elena didn't look up. She pressed 2 wires together with her teeth and tightened them around a fuse. "Don't worry," she said flatly, "they'll light up the night." Vasquez coughed, tried to laugh, but it broke into a groan. He was fading, but his eyes stayed on her, part disbelief, part admiration. Setting the first trap. The ridge dropped sharply 100 meters below the outpost, where a narrow goat trail cut through the rocks. It was the only direct approach that could handle a squad moving quickly. Elena knew they would try it first. She crouched low, digging into the rocky soil with her hands, sweat mixing with the dust despite the chill. Every second felt like it echoed, the clink of her spade, the click of the detonator safety. She buried a charge under loose stones, then stretched a thin wire across the path, blending it perfectly with the shadows of dawn. Her father's words came back to her as she worked. He had been a miner before the war. "Stone remembers," he'd say, showing her how to place charges so that the mountain itself carried the blow. She imagined him here, shaking his head at the madness, but guiding her hands all the same. When she was finished, the charge was invisible. One careless boot on that trail, and the earth itself would roar in protest. Improvising with scarcity. She had only 4 blocks of C4 left. Not enough to cover every route, not enough to guarantee safety. She had to think like them, predict their arrogance, their blind spots. Behind the outpost, a dry creek bed wound down toward the valley. She knew they'd send flanking squads through it, assuming the defenders would never expect an attack from behind. Elena crouched in the shallow ditch, hands numb, tying a tripwire between 2 boulders. This one she wired differently, not a kill trap, but a delay. The explosion would collapse the creek bed, raining rocks into a bottleneck. It wouldn't stop them forever, but it would slow them down long enough for her to fight on her terms. As she tightened the last knot, her stomach growled fiercely. She realized she hadn't eaten in nearly 2 days. Her lips were cracked from thirst, but she ignored it. The hunger meant nothing. Only the timing mattered. Talking to herself in the dark. By the time she crawled back toward the outpost, the first faint light of dawn touched the peaks. The snowcaps glowed orange, while the valleys remained in shadow. It looked almost peaceful, like a postcard. And for a moment Elena felt the strangeness of it. Beauty and war sharing the same sky. Her mind wouldn't stop racing. She muttered to herself, something she hadn't done since she was a child. Trails set. Creeks blocked. South wall still weak. Not enough time, not enough time. It kept her focused, a rhythm against the panic clawing at her chest. She refused to let the fear in. She couldn't afford it. Reinforcing the weakest point. She reached the south wall and paused. This was the outpost's blind spot, a shallow slope that curved upward gently, perfect for a mass rush. She had no more proper mines left. Just scraps, an old fuel canister, half a spool of wire, a cracked pressure plate salvaged from a wrecked vehicle. She knelt in the dirt and began piecing it together, like a puzzle with missing parts. Every move reminded her how fragile this defense was. If the fuel didn't ignite, if the plate misfired, it would be nothing but scrap. But when she finally stepped back, wiping grime across her cheek, she saw it for what it was, a snare. A desperate, ugly trap, but hers. Vasquez's fading voice. Back inside the outpost, Vasquez called out weakly. She hurried to him, crouching at his side. His lips were pale, his breath shallow. "You should have left already," he whispered. "Command's not coming back for us." Elena squeezed his shoulder. "I know. Then why keep wiring this place like it alive?" She looked at him, then really looked and spoke the truth. "Because if they take this ridge, the valley burns. Villages, families, everyone. This outpost isn't for us anymore. It's for them." Vasquez's eyes glistened. He closed them, sinking into a pained silence. But she saw the faintest nod before exhaustion pulled him under. The final check. Elena climbed the watchtower one last time as the sun broke fully over the mountains. Her body trembled from exhaustion, her hands raw from stone and wire. Below her, the traps were invisible, silent, but she knew where every thread lay hidden. She adjusted the detonator, checked the radio strapped to her chest. Static. No reinforcements. No help. Just her and the ridge. The enemy was coming. She could feel it in the stillness, the way the birds had vanished from the sky, the way the air itself seemed to hold its breath. She closed her eyes, drew a long, steady inhale, and whispered, "Let them come." The smoke still clung to the mountainside when the first echo of shouts cut through the night. The enemy wasn't retreating. If anything, the ambush had enraged them. Elena wiped soot from her face and crouched low behind the sandbags, scanning the ridgeline with her scope. Shapes moved in the dark, but no longer in clumsy groups. These were professionals now, spreading out, advancing in staggered lines. Their discipline was chilling. Marisol peeked up, clutching her rifle in one hand and the half-burned detonator in the other. They should have broken. Why aren't they breaking? Because they know it's just us, Elena replied, calm but grim. 2 women against an entire company? They'll throw men at us until we run out of bullets. The thought of being whittled down by attrition twisted in her gut. She had been on outnumbered missions before, but never like this. Never where survival hinged on one more bullet, one more blast, one more desperate trick to buy time. The wind shifted, carrying a sound that froze both women in place. The faint whirring of rotors. Drones. Elena cursed under her breath. They're bringing eyes in. Stay low. The first drone crested over the ridge, its thermal camera glowing red against the night. It hovered above the smoldering crater left by their earlier ambush, then tilted forward toward the outpost. Seconds later, tracers ripped across the compound as enemy rifles zeroed in on their positions. Marisol dropped flat, bullets snapping overhead. Splinters burst from the crate she was hiding behind. We can't hold with drones in the air. They'll pick us apart. Elena's mind raced. The outpost had a supply of EMP grenades, buried in the weapons locker. But getting there meant crossing 30 feet of open ground under fire. She took a breath, forced her heartbeat steady, and made her decision. Cover me. I'm getting the grenades. Before Marisol could protest, Elena bolted from the sandbags, sprinting across the compound. Bullets chased her, kicking up dust at her heels. The drone whirred, tilting to track her. She slid behind the weapons hut, chest heaving, then tore the lock off the crate with shaking hands. Inside, rifles, spare magazines, and the dull metal casings of the EMPs. Salvation. She grabbed 3 and clipped them to her vest. When she peeked out, she saw Marisol firing wildly at the ridge, forcing the enemy back behind rocks. The drone drifted lower, searching for another target. Elena yanked the pin on an EMP, whispered a prayer, and lobbed it into the sky. The grenade burst, with a sharp crack and a ripple of blue energy. The drone jerked midair, sputtered, then plummeted into the rocks below. Marisol let out a ragged cheer. That's 1 down. But even as Elena ran back with the other 2 grenades, she spotted more drones rising over the horizon. 3, 4, maybe 5. The enemy wasn't just probing anymore. They were preparing to overwhelm. She crouched beside Marisol, tossing her an EMP. Next time they close in, we use these. Aim for the sky. Marisol nodded, her lips trembling, but her eyes hardening. We're going to make them bleed for every step, aren't we? Elena chambered another round, staring into the darkness where the enemy gathered. Every single step. The night was far from over. The next assault came with terrifying coordination. Flares arced overhead, bathing the mountainside in hellish red light. The shadows were gone. Now the enemy advanced openly, rifles flashing, covering each other in perfect rhythm. Their boots thundered against the earth, a wave of steel and fury rushing toward the outpost. Marisol hammered the detonator again, triggering another line of buried charges. The ground erupted, spraying rock and fire, tearing a chunk out of the attacker's line. Screams pierced the night, but still the enemy pressed forward. They climbed over their fallen, relentless. Elena's rifle bucked against her shoulder. She dropped one, then another, but they were still coming. For every man she felled, 2 more rose behind him. Reloading. Marisol shouted, fumbling with her magazine. Elena slammed her last EMP into the dirt beside her, ready to hurl it at the next drone that dared drift close. Above, the whirring was constant now, drones circling like vultures, their cameras glowing as they tracked heat signatures. Elena, the left flank. Marisol cried. Elena swung her rifle. Enemy fighters had breached the razor wire, darting between the burning wreckage of the earlier blast. Their rifles barked, bullets sparking against the sandbags. There inside, Elena ripped the pin from the EMP and hurled it into the sky. The blast crackled, frying 2 drones at once. They fell like dead birds, but even as they crashed, enemy boots pounded against the outpost floor. The fight was no longer at the walls. It was inside. Elena dropped her rifle, drew her sidearm, and fired point-blank at the first man through the wire. He fell with a grunt, but another surged in, swinging the butt of his rifle. Elena ducked, drove her shoulder into his chest, and slammed him against the hot wall. Marisol screamed from behind her, firing into the dark. The muzzle flashes illuminated her terrified face, but her rounds found their mark. Another invader collapsed. The air was a storm of dust, smoke, and blood. The outpost trembled under the weight of the assault. Elena, Marisol shouted over the chaos. "We can't hold much longer." Elena shoved the dead soldier off her, panting hard. Her uniform was soaked in sweat and blood. Some hers, most not. She looked around at the shredded sandbags, the smoldering craters, the bodies piled at the wire. She knew Marisol was right. The outpost wasn't built for this. It was never meant to withstand an army. But she also knew retreat wasn't an option. If they abandoned the outpost, the enemy would pour through the pass by dawn, and everything south of this ridge would fall. She grabbed Marisol's arm, forcing her to meet her eyes. "We don't need to hold forever. Just until morning. Reinforcements are coming. All we have to do is survive." Marisol swallowed hard, tears streaking her dirt-stained cheeks. But she nodded. "Then we survive." The two of them stood back to back in the ruins of the outpost, their rifles raised, their silhouettes framed by burning wreckage. The enemy thought they were breaking through. But Elena and Marisol had decided. This mountain would be a graveyard before it became a prize. The night howled around them, and the battle raged on. The first hint of dawn was still hours away, but Elena's body already felt like it had lived through weeks in one night. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from sheer exhaustion, every muscle screaming. Smoke clung to her skin, blood soaked her fatigues, and her ears rang with the echo of explosions. Yet the enemy kept coming. They weren't reckless anymore. The constant charges had shifted into something colder, systematic probing. Short bursts of gunfire, then silence. Shadows moving at the edges of vision. They were testing the defenses, measuring responses, waiting for the moment when Elena and Marisol slipped. Marisol huddled, beside her, behind the last intact sandbag wall. Her face was pale under the grime, lips cracked, hands shaking as she reloaded her rifle with stubborn determination. She glanced at Elena with haunted eyes. "They know we're out of charges." Elena didn't deny it. The detonator lay silent now, its wires stretched across the compound to craters that had already spent their fury. The outpost had been transformed from a fortified position into a battered ruin. "We still have ammo," Elena said, checking her rifle. She had 3 magazines left. Marisol had 2. Together, that was maybe 90 rounds. 90 bullets against however many dozens or hundreds of enemy soldiers crawling up the ridge. Marisol looked away, her throat tight. "It's not enough." Elena's gaze hardened. "Then we make it enough." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the crackle of distant fire and the whisper of wind carrying the enemy's murmurs. They were regrouping, preparing for one final push. Elena forced her weary legs to stand, scanning the perimeter. The corpses littered outside, the wire testified to how hard they'd fought. She could see the blackened wrecks of drones, the twisted remains of rifles, the streaks of blood on the rocks. They had bought time, but time was running out. Her radio crackled. Static at first, then a faint voice struggling through the interference. "Outpost, do you read? This is command. Reinforcements inbound. ETA 4 hours. Elena's heart sank. 4 hours. They'd be lucky to last one. She clicked the transmit button. This is Outpost Sierra. 2 survivors holding position. Enemy force overwhelming. Request immediate air support. Silence. The reply came broken, words torn by static. Negative air assets tied up. Hold until ground units arrive. The radio went dead. Elena lowered it slowly, jaw clenched. 4 hours. No air cover. No miracles. Just the 2 of them, the rifles in their hands, and the mountain under their boots. Marisol had heard it too. Her eyes welled, but she forced a shaky laugh. So 4 hours. That's not so bad, right? We've already made it through half the night. Elena knelt beside her, placing a firm hand on her shoulder. Listen to me. We don't think about 4 hours. We think about 1 minute. Just one. Survive the next 60 seconds, then the next, then the next. That's how we get through. Marisol swallowed, nodding. 1 minute at a time. The moment was shattered by a sudden explosion at the perimeter. Dirt showered over them, and enemy boots thundered closer. Elena jerked her rifle up. They're coming again. The final assault had begun. The world had narrowed to smoke, flame, and the rhythm of her own heart hammering in her chest. Elena barely remembered pulling the last detonator. Only the roar that shook the ground beneath her boots and sent a wall of dust rolling through the valley. For a fleeting second, the enemy had been scattered like insects under sudden light. But the chaos did not last. By late afternoon, they regrouped. And now, as dusk settled, the true assault began. The sky turns against her. Tracer fire stitched through the air, glowing red lines arcing upward toward the outpost. Bullets smacked into the wooden tower above Elena's head, splinters raining down. She ducked lower, pressing her cheek against the sandbags, her rifle trembling in her hands from the strain of hours without rest. The enemy had brought heavier guns now, mortars. The first shell whistled overhead and slammed into the slope behind the ridge. The explosion rolled through her bones, knocking her breath out. She tasted dirt in her teeth. She risked a glance over the wall. Dark figures swarmed below, pushing forward behind shields of smoke grenades. Her traps had slowed them, cost them dearly, but they kept coming. It was no longer just a battle of tactics. It was a battle of endurance. And she was running out. Vasquez's fading strength. Inside the outpost, Vasquez stirred, his face pale as death. He coughed, tried to sit, and fell back with a groan. Elena sprinted to him, sliding on her knees to his side. You stay down, she snapped, pressing him back gently but firmly. You can't hold this alone, he whispered, eyes burning with shame. I'm not, she said, though her voice cracked on the word. She grabbed a water flask and forced it to his lips, but he turned away weakly. Her heart twisted. He was slipping further, and she couldn't stop it. Every minute she spent here, the outpost bled both of them dry. Fire on the southern slope. The crack of automatic rifles jerked her back into the fight. She rushed to the south wall, where her improvised fuel trap had been set. Enemy soldiers crawled through the smoke, their outlines ghostly, rifles raised. Elena waited, heart pounding in her throat. She let them get close, too close. Then her thumb pressed down on the crude trigger she'd wired hours ago. A thunderclap split the air. The fuel canister erupted in a burst of orange flame, fire washing across the slope. Screams tore through the smoke as silhouettes staggered and fell. The smell of burning fuel and flesh mixed, thick and sickening, but she forced herself not to flinch. She couldn't afford to feel. Not yet. Her hands betray her. By the time the fire died down, her hands shook uncontrollably. She dropped behind cover, clutching them against her knees. They were raw, blistered from heat, trembling from exhaustion. She had patched the ridge with steel and fire, but her body was unraveling. She muttered under her breath, a mantra to keep herself steady. Just hold. Just hold. Just hold. The words became a rhythm, like the beat of a drum, keeping her anchored in the storm. The enemy adapts. But the enemy was not blind. They had learned. No more reckless charges. Instead, they spread out, circling the ridge, looking for weaknesses. Her traps had bought her time, but now they worked like scouts, finding the gaps for her. A shot cracked from the east, the bullet grazing her helmet and sending her sprawling. She scrambled back, lungs heaving, vision swimming with stars. From the treeline, a sniper had locked onto her position. Elena crawled on her belly across the dirt, dragging her rifle. She found a gap between sandbags, steadied her breath, and fired once, twice, 3 times. On the third, she saw the flash of movement collapse in the trees. Her heart jolted with relief, but it was fleeting. For every one she cut down, 3 more crept forward. The memory of her father. In the haze of battle, her mind betrayed her with a memory. Her father in the workshop, guiding her small hands as she twisted copper wires. "You can't stop the mountain from falling," he told her, "but you can choose where the stones land." She clung to that thought now. The ridge would fall. She knew it. But if she could shape how it happened, maybe it would matter. Maybe it would save the valley below. A desperate decision. By nightfall, the outpost was half rubble. Sandbags shredded, wood splintered, smoke stinging her eyes. She sat beside Vasquez again, pressing her forehead briefly against his. His skin was cold, his breath shallow. "Listen," she whispered, gripping his shoulder. "If they breach, I'm lighting the last charge. Under the outpost. It'll bury this ridge. Them. Us. Everything." His eyes fluttered open, glassy with pain. He tried to speak, but no words came. Instead, he managed a weak squeeze of her hand. Agreement. Or farewell. She couldn't tell. She sat back, tears burning her eyes, but she forced them away. There was no time for grief. Only the next move. The ridge screams. The next assault came with a scream. Dozens of voices rising as one, echoing up the slope. Elena gritted her teeth, lifted her rifle, and fired until the barrel seared her palms. She ducked to reload, slammed a new magazine home, and kept firing. For a moment, she thought she heard voices behind her, not the enemies, but her squads, long gone, urging her on. "Hold the line, Elena. Hold the ridge." She shouted back, voice raw and ragged, "I'm still here." The mountains answered with gunfire. The last stand of Part 6. By midnight, she had nothing left but the last detonator in her pocket and a half-empty rifle. The enemy was still out there, shadows flickering in the smoke, closing in. Elena crouched in the ruins of the tower, shoulders sagging, lungs aching. Her entire body trembled from fatigue, but her eyes burned with a stubborn fire. If this was the end, she would write it in flame. She placed her hand on the final switch, whispering into the night as though the ridge itself could hear. "They'll remember this mountain." And she waited for the shadows to come close enough that the fire could take them all. The first golden hint of dawn crept across the ridge, turning the smoke into molten streams of fire. Elena felt the moment deep in her chest, that razor's edge of exhaustion where the body screamed for surrender, but the heart refused. The enemy didn't wait long. A trumpet-like call echoed from below, followed by the roar of voices. Boots thundered against the ground. Shadows moved like a storm tide, surging toward the broken perimeter of the outpost. This was it. Elena adjusted the sling of her rifle, then glanced at Marisol. Blood soaked through her sleeve, and her face was pale, but her eyes still burned with stubborn fire. She gave Elena a quick nod, a silent promise that she wouldn't falter. The attack came from all sides this time. Dozens of enemy soldiers crested the ridge in coordinated waves, covering each other with suppressing fire. Grenades arced into the outpost, exploding in showers of dirt and shrapnel. Elena shouted, "Take the right flank." Marisol shifted, teeth gritted, and opened fire. Her rounds cut down 2 men who were sprinting across open ground, their bodies collapsing mid-stride. But for every one that fell, 3 more appeared. Elena ducked as bullets chewed through the sandbags above her head. She rose, sighted down her rifle, and squeezed off a burst. The recoil slammed into her shoulder, but she barely felt it. Adrenaline drowned everything but survival. Enemy boots pounded closer. A group charged through the ruined wire, rifles blazing. Elena dropped 2, Marisol another, but the 4th reached the wall. He vaulted over, screaming, bayonet raised. Elena didn't think. She lunged, catching his wrist and twisting hard. The knife flashed away, and she slammed him into the dirt. The man snarled, swinging wildly. She jammed her rifle barrel against his chest and fired. His body went limp. Another enemy soldier grabbed her from behind, dragging her back. Elena thrashed, feeling the hot sting of a blade slice across her arm. She slammed her head back into his face, felt cartilage crunch, then spun and shoved him into the flames of a burning hut. His scream was short, cut off by the roar of fire. "Elena!" Marisol cried. Elena whipped around. Marisol was pinned behind cover, her rifle clicking empty as 2 enemies advanced on her. Without hesitation, Elena vaulted over rubble, firing as she moved. One dropped instantly. The second raised his weapon, but Elena rammed into him, driving her shoulder into his chest. They crashed to the ground, struggling. His hand fumbled for a pistol, but Elena seized a jagged rock and smashed it down. Once, twice, until he stopped moving. She staggered back, chest heaving, blood streaking her arm. Marisol stared at her, wide-eyed. "Elena, you're bleeding." Elena glanced down. The knife wound across her arm was deep, blood running freely. She tore a strip from her sleeve and tied it tight, ignoring the pain. "Not now. Focus." The battlefield raged on. The air was thick with smoke and fire. The ground shook with the force of grenades. The enemy pressed harder, their numbers overwhelming. Elena and Marisol fought like cornered wolves, every shot precise, every movement born of desperation. They weren't just holding ground anymore. They were surviving second by second. But Elena could feel it, the line breaking. Her last magazine was almost empty. Marisol's rifle jammed, and she cursed, scrambling for a sidearm. The ridge was quiet now, in that terrifying way battlefields sometimes go quiet, not because the fighting had ended, but because the world seemed to be holding its breath. Elena crouched among the ruins of the outpost, her body broken by fatigue, her skin streaked with soot and blood. The detonator lay heavy in her palm, its wire stretching down into the earth where she'd buried the last of her explosives. One press, and the entire ridge would collapse, swallowing friend and foe alike. She had accepted it, or at least she thought she had. The enemy's last push. Through the haze of smoke, figures appeared again, dozens of them, their boots crunching on gravel, their rifles glinting in the pale moonlight. They moved more cautiously now, fanning out, rifles raised. They had lost too many to her fire and traps, but desperation had driven them into a final charge. The sight tore at Elena's heart, not because she feared them, she no longer had space left for fear, but because it meant her choice was no longer delayed. She whispered to herself, her lips cracked and dry. "This is it. The last step." Vasquez's faint voice. Behind her, a hoarse cough broke the silence. She spun. Vasquez was still alive, somehow. His chest rose weakly, his face pale as ash, but his eyes, those dark, steady eyes, were fixed on her. "Elena," he rasped, his voice like sandpaper. "Not yet." Her breath caught. "They'll be inside any minute. If I don't." "Not yet," he repeated, his hand twitching toward hers. "Wait. Hold one more breath." She swallowed hard, torn in two. She wanted to argue, but there was something in his tone, not an order, but a plea. She nodded once, tucking the detonator close to her chest. The ghost of her squad. As the enemy crept closer, shadows weaving through the smoke, Elena's mind conjured faces she had fought beside, before this lonely mountain. Rodriguez, who always sang to steady her nerves before raids. Chun, who used to tie her bootlaces in double knots, saying she'd save her life someday. And Captain Noor, who had told her once, "If you ever hold the line, make it count." Their voices filled her ears now, whispers in the wind. Not hallucinations. No, Elena refused to believe that. It was memory. It was the weight of every bond, every loss, carrying her to this moment. And then, beneath it all, another voice, her father's. You can't stop the mountain from falling, but you can choose where the stones land. A spark in the dark. Gunfire erupted again. Bullets zipped overhead, punching into the sandbags, kicking up dust. Elena lifted her rifle, fired a few desperate shots, then ducked as sparks showered around her. Her finger brushed the detonator. One squeeze, and it was over. But then, through the chaos, she saw it. A flare of light from the western ridge, bright, arcing across the night sky. For a split second, she thought it was another enemy signal. Then her heart jolted. No, it was green. Friendly. Reinforcements. Her chest tightened. They weren't abandoned. The world hadn't forgotten them. Fighting for one more minute. She looked at Vasquez. He had seen it too, his lips twitching into the faintest broken smile. "One more breath," he whispered again. Elena forced herself to her feet, rifle shaking in her grip. Every nerve in her body screamed at her to collapse, to surrender to exhaustion. But she wouldn't. Not now. If reinforcements were coming, she had to give them time to reach the ridge. 1 minute. That was all she needed to buy. She leaned into the sandbags, bracing herself, and opened fire. Her shots rang out like defiant bells in the night. She hit one soldier, then another, her aim sharpened by desperation. The enemy faltered, ducking for cover, shouting to each other. For the first time in hours, Elena felt the tide bend. Not by much, but enough. The mountain shakes. Then came the counterstrike. Mortars again, closer this time. One shell slammed into the tower, collapsing what little remained. The blast threw Elena backward, her ears ringing, her arm numb from shrapnel tearing into her sleeve. She crawled back to the detonator, blood trailing in the dirt. The reinforcements were still minutes away. If the enemy overran the ridge before they arrived, it would all be for nothing. Her thumb hovered over the switch. Vasquez's last gift. Elena. Vasquez's voice cut through the ringing in her ears. She turned, and her heart clenched. He had dragged himself upright, leaning against the ruined wall, his rifle trembling in his arms. "You hold that switch," he said, voice fierce despite the weakness. "Let me buy you the minute." Before she could protest, he pulled the trigger, unleashing a storm of bullets down the slope. His body shook with the effort, each shot a piece of his life burning away. Tears blurred Elena's vision. She knew what it meant. He wasn't going to survive this night, detonator or not. His gift was time. The arrival. Shadows crept closer, bullets hammered the ridge, and Elena's hand trembled over the detonator. But then, through the smoke, she heard a new sound. The thunder of boots. Not enemies this time. Allies. From the western slope, silhouettes poured in, green armbands flashing in the firelight. Friendly forces charged the valley, their rifles blazing, their shouts fierce. The enemy broke. Panic spread through their line. Some fled, others fired wildly. But the mountain had shifted at last. Elena collapsed to her knees, the detonator slipping from her grasp. She had held. They had held. The price of holding. When the reinforcements reached her, she was half-conscious, her body trembling from blood loss and exhaustion. They pried the rifle from her hands, carried her down from the ridge. She clutched at Vasquez, but his body was still, his head slumped to one side. His final act had bought them the time they needed. As they carried her away, Elena looked back at the ridge, scarred, smoking, but still standing. Weeks later, when her wounds had closed and the war had shifted to another front, Elena returned to that ridge. She stood where the tower had once risen, her boots crunching on rubble that was now half buried under snow. The wind was sharp, biting against her scarred skin, but she hardly felt it. Her eyes traced every scar in the earth, every scorched patch of stone. She remembered where Vasquez had lain, where the sandbags had been shredded to dust, where she had clutched the detonator in her bloodied hand. The mountain looked peaceful now, but to her, it still breathed with ghosts. The memorial stone. At the center of the rebuilt outpost stood a marker. It wasn't grand, just a solid block of carved granite, plain and unpolished. Soldiers had hauled it up the ridge, chipping Vasquez's name deep into its face. Beneath his name, smaller letters carried the words, "He bought time. We lived." Someone, she didn't know who, had laid a rifle cartridge at its base, polished until it gleamed. Others had left flowers that wilted in the cold. There was even a child's drawing, left by villagers who had come to honor the fallen. Elena knelt in front of the stone, her hand trembling as she reached out to trace the letters. Her throat tightened. She hadn't cried the night of the battle, nor the day after. She had been too numb, too consumed with survival. But here, with the mountain silent and the names carved in stone, the weight broke free. Tears slid down her dirt-streaked cheeks, dropping onto the frozen ground. A letter she never sent. From her jacket pocket, Elena pulled a crumpled piece of paper. It was a letter, one she had written in the hospital but never sent, addressed to Vasquez's family. She unfolded it slowly, her breath fogging the air as she read the words to the stone. He fought until his last breath. He wasn't afraid. He saved me. He saved us all. I don't know how to thank him, except to make sure his name is never forgotten. Her voice broke on the last sentence. She folded the paper again and tucked it under a small rock at the base of the marker, a private offering no one else needed to read. A visit from the villagers. As the sun dipped lower, Elena heard footsteps behind her. She turned to see 3 villagers, a mother, a boy, and an old man, making their way up the trail. They carried bundles of wildflowers, their colors bright against the gray stone. The boy, no older than 12, stared at Elena in awe. "Are you the one who fought here?" he asked. Elena hesitated, then nodded. The boy's eyes widened, and he pressed the flowers into her hand. "Thank you," he whispered, "for saving my village, for saving my father." Her chest ached. She wanted to say she hadn't done it alone, that Vasquez deserved this thanks more than she did. But the boy's gaze was pure, his gratitude unwavering. She accepted the flowers with a faint smile, placing them at the base of the stone, carrying the mountain forward. When the villagers left, Elena remained, staring out at the valley. Smoke still curled faintly from distant fires. The war wasn't over, not by a long stretch. She knew she would be called to fight again, to hold another line, to face another impossible choice. But something had changed. The mountain had taken Vasquez, but it had given her a new strength. She understood now what it meant to endure, not for glory, not even for survival, but for the lives tethered to hers. She whispered into the wind, as though the mountain could hear, "I'll carry it forward. Both our names. Both our fight." The words vanished into the cold air, but deep inside, she felt them settle, a promise carved into her very bones. The final look back. As twilight painted the ridge in shades of violet, Elena rose to her feet. She tightened her jacket, adjusted her pack, and turned toward the path that wound down the mountain. She paused once, looking back. The memorial stone stood silent, framed by the jagged peaks. The mountain seemed to watch her, not as a place of death anymore, but as a guardian of memory. And in that silence, she could almost hear Vasquez's voice again, steady, unyielding. "Hold one more breath." Elena smiled faintly, her tears drying in the cold wind. She took a long breath, steady and calm, then stepped away from the ridge. The mountain would remember her, and she would never let the world forget him.